know I keep saying that over and over, but let's see what's going on with Patrick. Alrighty, well, we'll go ahead and get started. So nobody had any questions for me. I'll get into, what's it, chapter, this is our next to last chapter. So chapter 33, this is where we talk about the invertebrates. Do I have the recording on? Yes, I already turned it on. Good job. Okay, so I guess if I was going to say one word about the invertebrates, you'd have to say just diversity, right? There's just so many different kinds. And on this picture here, I found it online. I think I was more enamored by the artwork, you know, by the color blends. But no, I believe, I don't know in all cases, but I'll bet you in a lot of those cases, those are actually the natural color of those beetles. Beetles come in all kinds of different colors. I think those are all probably beetles. There are just a boatload of insects. There's a boatload of invertebrates, right? Y'all remember what invertebrates are. What's the big thing about invertebrates? What's the real, you know, the number one distinguishing characteristic? Oh, there's a lot of them. Anybody? Sean, Maria, hello. Hi, can you all hear me? How are you? How about you, Sean? What do you mean? Is it cutting in and out, Maria? Sean, how's the volume? Is it good to you? Okay. Did you hear the question I had then? Hi, Patrick. I think you're online with us now. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So what? I was getting ready to talk about or we're going to get ready to talk about the invertebrates. And I kind of was going back to, I don't know, maybe 6th, 7th grade life sciences classes that you might have had. And I asked you, what was an invertebrate? What's the big number one characteristic that makes an invertebrate an invertebrate? There's two big groups of animals out there. One of them is the invertebrates. Your snakes would not fit in this category, obviously. That's right. Invertebrates means they don't have a backbone, okay? That means they don't have a vertebral column. Now, what you're going to find out when we get into the next chapter, when we get into chapter 34, there's going to be another example of those times where we've discussed this semester where something is classified as something, but every once in a while there are the weird ones that kind of stand out. So when we get into actually what makes a vertebrate, there's going to be those real vertebrates, and then there's more like technical vertebrates, which really is nothing more than showing you that there's many different ways to accomplish something. I'll talk more about vertebrates later, why there's a vertebral column, but there is more than one way to do it. Okay, the wasp on the right-hand side. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you look at this? Now, we're going to talk a bunch of different invertebrates, but insects and arthropods is going to be one of them. But when you look at that, I mean, okay, you might see danger or warning or something like that, but, you know, overall, how would you say the level of structure is of that wasp? That's not a bad way of saying it, I don't think. This is something that invertebrates, as we go through talking about them and organisms in general, this is something, what I'm trying to pull out, and I'm obviously not doing a very good job of it, is something that we start to see more and more so as we go into the different groups of invertebrates and even into the vertebrates. And actually it goes back. I'm sorry, I have a loud snoring dog. She's an old dog, and so she's a little bit loud, so I apologize. You hear in the background. Thank you, Emily. Emily. Yeah, well, if it bothers, let me know, and I'll go ahead and and wake her up. But and it goes back to that what I talked in chapter 32. If you go back and you look at the Hox genes, remember I said one of the innovations that occurred among the animals, among this group of organisms we call the animals, were these Hox genes. And Hox genes are basically genes or groups of genes, right, that control the placement and the type of, let's call it accessories that an organism might have, you see. And as we go through evolutionary time, what we see has happened is where there was kind of that mixture of Hox genes and that one real sort of simple crustacean had a bunch of legs that were exactly the same. What we see is through time, these Hox genes mutate and shuffle and duplicate. And what they do is they end up creating segments in a body, you see. Remember I told you that was a characteristic of life, right? Or I'm sorry, characteristic, or one of the, back up, Steve, one of the major characteristics of many groups of animals is this idea of being segmented, right? We're segmented, we have a vertebral column. Worms, you think about your typical earthworm is segmented. How about the worm the other day that we did in dissection? Did that worm, was that worm segmented? Was it like an earthworm? No, it was pretty slick, wasn't it, right? It wasn't broken down into sections. Well, yeah, that's because that's not a segmented worm. There are segmented worms and unsegmented worms. And it's easy to understand in your head what a segmented worm looks like. It looks like an earthworm. It's segment after segment after segment. Well, if you look at this insect, don't you kind of see the same thing? Don't you see segments, areas? They may not be, like inner tubes for, round circles like in an earthworm, pop, 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 one right after the other. But I mean, I could say maybe up here, that's a segment, right? Because that's the, let's say the antenna segment. And even like lobsters will have antennas and antennules. So they'll have two sets. Okay, we could call that a segment. And we might even put these together if we wanted to. Because remember, you can do that with segmentation, right? You can combine things. And that's a segment. Okay, and we could look at that segment, we could say, what is that segment, what is that group of body parts collectively together, what's it doing, right? So that segment that I've outlined in the blue, let's go ahead and include the antenna, because they really are, even though they could be considered different segments as well. But if you had to guess what this part of the organism's body is mainly responsible for, and I did talk about this in class the other day when we were in chapter 32. I think I climbed up on the, I climbed up on the table, didn't I, right? So does that make sense that the sensory part, or can you understand why that makes sense, why the sensory part would be at the front of the organism, right? It's simple physics, isn't it, right? It's the first part of the environment you come into contact with. So we could say that is the sensory part, or the sensory segment. And remember now, with segmentation, what can happen is you can start to combine segments. So maybe what that head segment of that insect there, the sensory one, as Sean pointed out for the function, is actually a combination of segments. There might be antenna segments. There might be mouth part segments, you see. And then if you look back a little bit further, that's a segment, right? Or maybe it's even a group of segments. I'm sort of foreshadowing here, folks, because that is what happened in insects. These segments begin to multiply, and then they begin to grow together and become bigger segments. But there's a middle segment, right? Can anybody see the third segment that I might use as an example? What I might circle? If you can touch pen the screen, then you can draw it, or you can just tell me. Yeah, back in the back, right? So let's go back to this second segment or segments, all right, group of segments. What do you think the purpose of that group of segments is? And yes, we could talk about the fact that probably inside of there is parts of the cardiovascular system and all those other internal organs that certainly must be there. But let's think about these in terms of function with your environment. And in a very gross kind of form, in a very anatomical kind of form. So that middle segment might be involved in what? Actually, I should do a little bit further. Let's go ahead and include this last leg in there too. Now, of course, not all of them have these, though, which are wings. But, you know, many of them, this is what creeps us out about most insects, right? They have lots of these things, right? So what do these things do? What do these, I don't want to say the word because then I give it away. What do these do? What do you... I hope this is just lag in the computer. I'm like, oh my goodness, I've lost my ability to lead people into information. What do you do with your legs, folks? Yeah, you move, don't you? What do you do with wings if you have them? You don't have, not everybody's got them. Not every insect has got them, right? Yeah, you fly around, you move. So that second group of segments, or that second big segment, we could consider the locomotory segment. Is that a word? Whatever, it's a new one now. So we get the sensory segment up front, makes sense. The the locomotive segment, which is you got to be able to move around, you know, walk and or fly. And then in the back in the abdomen, we might put like the digestive organ. We could put the reproductive organs back there, and we could pack some of that other stuff. Now, of course, like I said, internally, everything, you know, the cardiovascular system flows throughout, but I'm thinking about it functionally. So the back segment, having the digestive system and the reproductive organs, it would be responsible for obviously that, right? The food would pass from the mouth, down through a tube, through the middle segment, simply a tube, just passing through, heading on down to the stomach that's in the abdomen where digestion would actually occur, right? And then the reproductive organs back there, you would produce whatever gamete your sex was, and then perhaps you would deliver it out of this area, an ovipositor, for example. Ovipositor. Well, that's a good word. Ovipositor. What's an ovipositor? I'm not sure about the spelling. Some insects have ovipositors. It's a really cool word to impress your friends with. As a clue, remember in Bio 1 you talked about ova and ovum. That's another word for something. That's in my contact. Ovipositors. Come on. What's the ovi? OVI. Ova, ovum. It's like I'm saying a chant. Yeah, eggs, right? So a positor would be something that positions eggs. So a female insect might have an ovipositor, and she might take that ovipositor, that tail, and put it somewhere on a leaf, or maybe she would lay it on the body of an organism in which she's paralyzed, like ichneumoniid wasps do. There's a group of wasps known as ichneumoniid wasps, and they do this really great thing for Halloween, which was yesterday with a spider, I believe, that continued to sting it, not kill it, but paralyze it. The female then lays her eggs on there, which hatch and feed upon the alive but paralyzed spider until it's all gone. Or they might ovipositor her eggs into your skin, and you might end up with things like bot flies and all that sort of stuff, right? Pretty cool. Everybody, maybe not so cool. Good for Halloween. You get the idea of what I'm talking about with this idea of segmentation and how that's really important and how that ties to the Hox genes. Remember, the Hox genes were where these different things, wings and legs and antenna and eye, where that stuff goes. And so if you make a lot of them and you mutate them, then you can make lots of these different things that can do things, like antenna that can sense and legs that can walk and wings that can fly. Right? We capiche on all that? Sounds cool, right? We're not going to start there, obviously, because we're going to start with those critters that do, as my professor said in college. He was from Kentucky. And he'd say they do so well with so little. Meaning that when we look at organisms, we should not judge them for if they're complex and if they're simple or if they're advanced. Simple and advanced are the two words typically that he usually had problems with. We should call them more ancestral and more derived because it makes more sense. Because, for example, the critters we're going to start with up here at the top, the porifera. Remember in lab the other day? There ain't much to them, is there? Right? It's basically kind of a mashup of cells, you know, just sort of a collection of cells. Now, we're going to see today that those cells are held together in a little more cohesive fashion than just kind of hanging out. But nonetheless, when you looked at it under the microscope, isn't that what it looked like? It was real diffuse. Things could flow through it. It's a filter feeder, right? It's a filter feeder. And porifera, those sponges, as I mentioned to you by the definitions that we use, are considered animals, all right? So they do so well with so little. I think I said this in class the other day. This is actually a mistake. That should curve there, because remember the poriferans, actually, this is messed up too. The poriferans are parazoa. The poriferans don't have real tissues. I should tell the publisher about that. So, right, so metazoa, I guess, is another word for parazoa, but the point is they're not diploblastic. That's for sure. Ctenophorans and remember diploblastic, those were the germ layers, those first cell layers. And what I mean by germ layers in this case is not causing disease, but that gives rise to other cells, gives rise to other organs or tissues, organs, and organ systems. Remember, there was one on the inside, the endoderm. In the middle was the mesoderm. And on the outside, and you say outside of what? That hollow ball of cells, folks. That's where the ectoderm was. Now, you either had ectoderm and endoderm, or you might have one in the middle. The two at the top that are diploblastic, di meaning two, blastic is germ layer, have two. Except for the poriferans, all right? So let's go into the sponges. And now that we've saw them under the lab, and we can appreciate them for their lack of complexity, let's say, to be PC with the sponges around. Let's appreciate them for how well they do what they do. As my professor used to always say, they do so well with so little. All right, so they're multicellular. Yes. They aren't tissues, but they are multicellular. They have three functional layers. Those aren't the same thing as germ layers. They have an outside, a middle, and an inside, which I'll show you in a minute. And for the most part, they have that vase arrangement, like that big basket sponge I had in class, remember? Oh, if you ever go snorkeling or scuba diving in the Keys, take time to look in those basket sponges as you're snorkeling or scuba diving over them. Many times juvenile fish will raise their young in there, and you look in, you'll be like, oh my God, there's all these different, like different sergeant majors and what's the other fish? Chromis, blue chromis. Oh my God, they're beautiful. Again, that might be my dog you hear. No tissues, of course, no tissues, no organs, no symmetry, asymmetry. The purple thing that looks like it might be radial, but it's truly not. And of course, a lot of sponges that we looked at in class today were certainly not symmetrical. They're globular, but an indication that I lost my audio. Now it's back. Hello, everybody. Give me a sound check. I'm sorry. I got some indication that said I lost my audio. What is the sense of having these gadgets? Okay, good. All right. Sorry. Strangely enough, well, maybe not strangely enough, but interestingly enough, these critters are mostly found in the ocean, mostly marine. That's what we mean by marine. Marine means saltwater. But there are a few that live in freshwater. One that I actually have in class, a very small, tiny ones, only 50 species. It seems to be a phyla that, of course, evolved in the ocean and pretty much has stayed there, with a few venturing out into freshwater. So, of course, immediately what you ought to think, well, is that a big deal? Well, yeah, it's a big deal, because you're going from this hypertonic to hypotonic environment. You got to figure out how you're going to deal with that, especially as you're moving along the way, right? Maybe it was one adaptation that happened, just like that. Who knows? They don't move around, so in order to get your youngins out away from you so they don't eat what you eat, remember, these are filter feeders, but the more water you got to yourself, the more food you're going to get. So you send them larvae on their way, and they look like something in the upper right. That's a cool picture of one. That's a larvae of a sponge. Who can tell me what planktonic meant? What does it mean if I tell you that the larvae are planktonic? Yeah, and you understand that that doesn't refer to, oftentimes people will say, oh, look at all the different plankton. Just remember that just because there are even fish that when they're juveniles are planktonic, that they float. Eels, for example, which are fish. All right, now, if they have a planktonic larvae and an adult sessile, or in other words, the adults don't move, do you see an advantage in that? From some evolutionary dispersal uh, way. It's kind of like with the pollen and the seeds of the yep, isn't it? It's kind of like the tree. Isn't it neat? And we've been talking. How many times have I said this? Right? Convergent evolution. Isn't it neat how convergent evolution explains things as a shark and a dolphin look alike, but it explains in really broad senses how critters of very different types kind of do things the same way. I mean, there are more than one way, but I mean, there's a lot of similarities. Like, for example, the way these sponges, when they form gametes, we'll talk about in just a second, you can imagine they must form dozens of these because they just disperse them out into the water. And getting rid of their young, very much like I said, seeds and all that sort of stuff. There's some very basic driving forces in life, no matter what type you are. What's really cool about these critters is many times, like that one in the lower left, look at that, isn't that neat? That's a sponge. It can be found in deep water. That's over 2,500 meters that sponge was photographed. And real fast, let's see, it's 10 meters an atmosphere. It's 250 atmospheres. So what you feel standing on the surface of the Earth right here, it's 250 times that in pressure, if I did any of that right. But anyway, so, cool, but not someplace I'd want to live. Someplace I'd like to go see, but not someplace I could live. We'd be crushed, wouldn't we? Imagine that, 200, what in pounds, 16 pounds per square, no, 15 pounds per square inch are pushing on us. So now you have 250 times that. Okay, let's get up and close and personal with our sponge. Like I said, there's three basic layers. There's the epidermis. Really labeled. It's not really called that either, though. But on the inside is the panel. Hello. Good gosh. Hello. Oh my goodness. Sorry about this, folks. Jeez. I hate this when this happens like that. All right, so. Okay, let's hope that that doesn't happen again. Sorry about that. See, make sure the recording is still on. Okay, hold on one second, folks. I'm going to do something.